Hello and welcome back. All in All is a podcast produced in collaboration with Democracy at Work. Here we explore history, science, culture, and more to imagine what a post-capitalist world might look like and how we might get there. It's founded on the belief that our technological imaginations have outraced our social imaginations, leaving us at the mercy of the exploitative few. And along those lines, the theme today is digital Nuremberg, how we're living in a digital Nuremberg rally and how we could break out. For a long time, I want to start with this. Digital Nuremberg, a lot of people will think, okay, you're talking about fake news from the right. And in part, we will be. But I have to say that for a long time, when it became au courant in the mid-2010s, to talk about fake news, misinformation, disinformation, and so on, I resisted talking about it, and I wasn't sure exactly why. It certainly wasn't because social media is a falsehood machine. It certainly is, and I think we all know that by now. But I realized after a fairly short period of time that a lot of rhetoric about quote unquote fake news is being used not to uncover the truth, but to replace one false reality with another. You know, before the whole issue of fake news came up, before Trump's first election and so on, we were already living in a world of media manipulation. It's just that it was the mainstream media that was doing it. It wasn't as decentralized as it is today. But today, it's decentralized, and yet it's more powerful and more effective than ever. So it's become a false reality that we're all immersed in, or maybe it would be more accurate to say it's a series of false realities, each of us having a slightly different version of it, dividing us into groups and turning us against one another. But in the end, it functions exactly like a giant propaganda rally, a digital Nuremberg that shapes our perceptions and our behavior and has us serving people who don't care about our lives at all. Sure, there are differences between this particular digital Nuremberg and, let's say, the political spectacles of the past, like the original Nuremberg rallies, which took place from, I think it was 1923 to 1938, in what became Nazi Germany, held by the Nazi Party. Normally, although they were advertised as kind of conventions of the Nazi Party and its followers, really, except for one gross exception we'll get to, they were never used to set policy. They were pulling people together with a shared vision of how the world works. But this, as we'll get to, again, as we go on, it's not a shared vision now. It's a manipulated vision that serves and manipulates each of us according to our biographies and our needs. But behind it, this algorithmic manipulation of reality is one singular force, one power. It's the power of concentrated wealth, militarism, empire, or what the Transcontinental Institute sometimes calls hypercapitalism. It reaches from the phone in your bedroom to the killing fields of Gaza. But why Nuremberg? Why call it Nuremberg? Well, because one thing the Nuremberg rallies did was they created a false sense of society for the people who were swept up in them. They made people feel not alone, exactly the way that a lot of what happens online is supposed to make us feel not alone. In the case of the original Nuremberg rallies, they were supposed to demonstrate Volksgemeinschaft, I think I'm pronouncing that right, a people's community, a singular community. And how many times have we heard that online is a community, that our Facebook friends are a community, that Twitter is a community? Now that it's X, I think people might not say that so much, but this artificial synthetic sense of community. And when we boast about it online, we seem to overlook the fact that every community in history has had its outsiders and enemies. But so, okay, the original Nuremberg rallies wanted to make the fascist regime look better than it was, and it wanted to unite the German people, as it defined the German people, in a false belief that they were living in a great society. Those rallies, by the way, people don't realize it now, but they were the height of communications technology and the way they were handled. They were filmed and broadcast extensively, and they were designed to manipulate emotions. They were designed to give us all a sense of shared, of them all, I should say. I was certainly not part of it, a sense of shared experience. And that includes the movies that Leni Riefenstahl made, Triumph of the Will, and the others about the Olympics. Even the camera techniques were designed to make you feel you were there, you were in it, you were part of it. But they weren't celebrating human diversity, needless to say. In fact, Joseph Goebbels said about the Nuremberg rallies that they were designed to change each participant, quote, from a little worm into part of a large dragon, end quote. From a little worm to a large dragon. That's mob psychology. And as we all know, I think by now, social media also encourages and heightens mob psychology. So, by the way, it was an annual event from 1927 to 1938. I just saw it in my notes. So listen, these rallies worked great for a while, according to the historians, impressing Germans, reinforcing the Nazi Party's image, creating a sense of pride. They would get up to 1 million attendees. Now, in thinking about the communication aspect of this, I thought about a very important book that seems to have been forgotten these days, a book of essays that I think came out at around 1970 or the early 1970s, called The Consciousness Industry by Hans Magnus Enzensberger. And he has an essay in it called The Industrialization of the Mind. That kind of lays the ground for what I'm talking about. He begins by saying, it's translated from German, but by himself. He begins by saying, all of us, no matter how uncertain or irresolute we are, like to think that we reign supreme in our own consciousness, that we are masters of what our minds accept or reject. And then he goes on to say, newsprint, film, television, public relations, each tends to be evaluated separately. Hardly anyone seems to be aware of the phenomenon as a whole, the industrialization of the human mind. This is a process which cannot be understood by a mere evaluation of its machinery, end quote. That is so important because as we look at social media, people think about the technology, and it is an extremely powerful technology, but they don't think about the age-old instincts for manipulation and control driving the people who drive that technology. And that's why I think it's so important to look at this. None other than Bertolt Brecht, the German Marxist playwright and activist, said, I'm going to say 1932, in an essay called Theory of Radio, he kind of predicted the internet. He was talking about that great new, quote unquote, great new technology called radio. And he said, radio must be changed from a means of distribution to a means of communication. Radio would be the most wonderful means of communication imaginable in public life, a huge linked system if it were capable not only of transmitting, of receiving, of allowing the listener not only to hear, but to speak, and did not isolate him, but brought him into contact, meaning with others. He goes on to say that proposals like his are, quote, only the natural consequences of technological development, and they help toward the propagation and shaping of a new social system, end quote. Slight paraphrasing on my part there. So that's what everybody said about the internet when it first came out. Incredible tool for democratization, incredible leveling of the communication playing field. Anyone can reach anyone else. Most famous person may see a comment from the least famous person, and so on. This was going to be a wonderful tool. Of course, we now know that the algorithms make that impossible. We see what the system wants us to see, and what we want to see is that which fuels our outrage. But again, why in Nuremberg? Because a Nuremberg rally was a rally of us against them. It was a rally, in a sense, built out of years of frustration as the German economy and its society faltered. It was built on pent-up rage, looking for a victim, the need for glorification and making ourselves heroic, those human instincts. So the internet, by algorithmically driving us to our angriest and most intense emotions, has become an amplifier for all of those things as well. And as far as fake news is concerned, I want to talk about that a little bit too, because we hear a lot about fake news, misinformation, disinformation. It gets exaggerated. And there was a very interesting study that was published in 2020 it's a political science study entitled The Quote Unquote Need for Chaos and Motivations to Share Hostile Political Rumors. And the whole thesis of this research is that a lot of people who share quote unquote fake news online know it's fake. They're doing it because they're mad. They're doing it because they want to break down the political system, or as the authors say, to burn down the political cosmos. They just want to destroy everything. It's F everything. And so a lot of fake news they glory in it being fake news. And the researchers found that these hostile political rumors were closely aligned with frustrated working class individuals. But they conclude, quote, that our findings imply that a challenge facing modern society is the existence of marginalized status seekers, people outside the system, who are willing to spread rumors in order to incite chaos in a society that they do not feel recognizes them, end quote. I would politely argue that this is also what has driven a lot of fascist movements in the past. They're going against some previous research to do this, but they are pretty strong about it. They point out that a lot of people in social psychology in these fields say that people share partisan rumors because they want to push one party over another, but it doesn't necessarily work that way. They're pissed off at everybody, and they're exploding out at everyone. They write that alongside growing partisan polarization, advanced democracies, meaning U.S., Western Europe, and so on, have also experienced rising levels of inequality and stagnation in real wages. As these objective indicators, they write, as these objective indicators of social well-being have worsened, citizens living in those countries have increasingly expressed a feeling of quote unquote losing out and have become increasingly discontent with the political establishment, end quote. They go on to say that we hypothesize that some individuals are so disaffected with the current structure of society and their status in it that they engage in indiscriminate sharing of hostile political rumors to disrupt the entire democratic, small d, cosmos. So there we are, people enraged. We saw a lot of fake news or false rumor sharing on the right. Then Donald Trump was elected in 2016 for a variety of reasons, and studies have shown that online fake messages or social media posts from Russia or Russia-aligned forces had virtually no effect on the outcome of that election. Other factors did. We can talk about that at some point if you like. But we got Russiagate, which, among other things, was a moral panic. And this, in a sense, was an extension of the rally to the other side of the political aisle. And I'll tell you what I mean. First of all, in terms of a moral panic, the concept of moral panic was publicized, was really developed by the sociologist Stanley Cohen, whose book in the early 1970s was entitled Moral Panic and Folk Devils. He said a moral panic is, quote, when a conditioned episode, person, or group of persons emerges to become defined as a threat to society. Slight paraphrase there, presented in a stylized and stereotypical fashion by the mass media, And then he says, quote, the moral barricades are manned by editors, bishops, politicians, and other correct thinking people. Socially accredited experts pronounce their diagnoses and solutions, end quote. In the past, famous moral panics included exaggerated fears of violent crime, accusations that music lyrics promote violence, satanic cults abusing children, more generalized Cold War Red Scare. That's why I say that Russiagate was a moral panic. It was a genuine panic in a way, but it also served social purposes, in the ways that previous moral panics had done. In fact, it was textbook in a way. The internet memes from former Soviet countries, as I say, I can send research papers if people are interested. Researchers studied Democratic and Republican voters who interacted with accounts operated by these troll firms and concluded, and I quote, we find no evidence that interacting with these accounts substantially impacted six political attitudes and behavior. But the troll farms were presented as an existential threat to democracy itself, despite the absence of evidence then or since. The Washington Post famously changed its motto to, quote, democracy dies in darkness. The idea that Russia subverted the 2016 election became an article of faith, despite this lack of evidence. Assertions from the U.S. intelligence community were known to be deceptive, known to have lied to both the American people and people abroad, were taken at face value. The ridiculously inept Steele dossier was treated as holy writ. Millions of Americans chuckled over stories of Donald Trump and quote unquote P tapes, and folk devils were everywhere in the Russiagate narrative. There were false stories about, I don't know, business people, troll farmers in Moldavia, journalists. Vladimir Putin was folk devil number one. I don't consider him a good guy, but he was attributed with almost superhuman powers to change the world and our fates by magic. Then there was Steve Bannon, Cambridge Analytica, and so on. The moral entrepreneurs who drove all this included both Democratic leaders who had it very much in their own interests to shift blame for their own disgraceful loss. Mainstream media, they could both exculpate themselves with this narrative. And you could see it in MSNBC, Rachel Maddow, the Hillary Clinton people, wild stories about linked servers between Trump and a bank in Russia, or Russia hijacking a power station, on and on and on. No evidence for any of it. And then there were the people who suddenly became famous as they were entrepreneurs too, blowing this issue out of proportion by claiming that they and they alone knew who the real enemies of America were, which is very McCarthyite and somewhat fascistic in its thinking. So they put these groups together of anonymous, prop or not, and these other groups that ID'd ordinary American citizens as tools of the enemy. It was really, really awful. It was really something to see. So I won't go on too much about the moral panic, except to say it made it impossible to talk in a rational way with anyone on the liberal side of the spectrum about this issue. If you didn't participate in the panic, you were on the other side. Any journalist like myself, or for that matter, anybody on social media who expressed doubt about this whole Russiagate narrative, got used to being called Putin's puppet or being asked, how much is Putin paying you? So the hostility directed towards Trump and his supporters quickly spread to the non-democratic left, to the independent people, to journalists. As one writer wrote, he said, quote, every skeptical utterance about Trump Russia became pro-Trump propaganda, end quote. You could attack Lindsey Graham, who I don't like, but I mean, with memes like he's quote unquote licking red boots, which to me seems a little homophobic too. You could allow Democrats to attack opponents as both treacherous and implicitly communist, and that way you could shaft the Sanders left. Democratic strategist Donna Brazil, by the way, once tweeted, quote, "The communists are now dictating," end quote, American policy under Trump. When I asked her to clarify very politely on Twitter that Putin is not a communist or leftist, she blocked me, which is another part of moral panic. Block anyone who doesn't agree with you. So moral panic, occasionally they misstep, the moral panic artists. For example, Susan Rice, when the Black Lives Matter protests arose, thankfully and wonderfully, after the horrific murder of George Floyd, Democratic insider Susan Rice initially floated the idea that Russia might be behind them. But she quickly got shut down because the moral entrepreneurs behind the Russiagate scare did not want to go up against Black Lives Matter. They wanted to co-opt it. But why did Russiagate become a moral panic? Because panics can paradoxically be reassuring. As Stanley Cohen wrote, quote, "Ambiguity, which gives rise to anxiety, is eliminated by structuring the situation to make it more predictable," end quote. So for all the Democrats and liberals whose universe was upended, and I understand that, they were traumatized, and I understand that too. For all of them, the Russiagate narrative could ground them, give them someone to blame besides themselves or their parties. As Enzensberger pointed out, you have to believe you have freedom of thought in order to be manipulated this way by the mind industry. You have to believe that in the Proclamation of Human Rights that you have a right to think for yourself, and that you do think for yourself without manipulation. And there's no way around it, though, that we're all subject to this 24/7. And sometimes Democrats, too, willingly submit to it, just the way that the right did in that study I was telling you about. For example, I once told a friend not to believe what they heard about Russia on MSNBC, and they said to me, quote, "I know it's not true, but it's so much fun." So the Russiagate panic, look, for the national security state, it certainly did its job. It boosted support for censorship, weakened biased reporting, and added continued support for a failed political establishment. So the next moral panic may be even more destructive. But before we get to that, I just want to point to a couple other ways in which we are manipulated, not only by the right, but by the left. After Hillary Clinton secured the election in 2016, when I was still working for Bernie Sanders, I wrote a piece for I wrote a piece for the Huffington Post entitled "Bernie Still Has Clout." This was about who had the right to wield influence at the Democratic National Committee. That post had literally more than 1,000 comments saying, no, he doesn't, in various ways, shapes, and forms. And I couldn't track any of them to an actual living person. At that time, you had to have a Facebook, a couple maybe, but you had to have a Facebook account to comment. And every single Facebook page I went to was either blank or blocked or gone. So this was, I found out later, almost certainly the work of a Democratic group run by David Brock that took at least $1 million and probably more to plant false social media posts everywhere to promote Hillary's campaign. They advertise it as being primarily against Trump, but it's pretty clear it went beyond that. There was an even worse incident with Jeremy Corbyn when he asked his party to run a series of ads on issues he was campaigning about. It turns out that Labor Party insiders ran phony Facebook ads, or rather real Facebook ads, that were only directed at Jeremy Corbyn and maybe 6 or 7 of his key advisors and friends. No one else saw them, just less than a dozen people for sure, but they did that to fool Jeremy Corbyn and his people into thinking they were doing what he asked when they never had any attention to. And a mainstream Labor Party media consultant put this in his book as just another thing we do. That's how much the digital Nuremberg rally can manipulate the world to make us on an individual level or highly selective level do whatever it wants. Well, who's behind this? That's the logical question, right? Starts with, among other things, the military. Yasha Levine wrote a very good book called Surveillance Valley that talks about the ways in which the internet was crafted by the U.S. so-called Department of Defense and the United States military, as well as corporate interests. They've structured it to serve their own purposes from the start. There are the forces that Hans Magnus Enzensberger identified of the manipulators, of course, corporate leaders and other powerful interests in this country and elsewhere. We're looking at what amounts to an invasion and occupation of the land, the country that should be ours alone, the mind, our time, our attention. And these occupiers are like any other occupying force. They're stealing the natural resources of the land they've occupied as quickly as they can, which in this case is our independence, our ability to act as political agents. And worst of all, the digital Nuremberg has moved from the online world into the real world. There was an excellent column in the New York Times, of all places, by Tressie Cottom McMillan, who described the whole Trump-Musk first 100 days circus as presenting a video game kind of conflict to their followers. It had all the kind of attributes of a first-person shooter game. There was a villain, there was a hero, there was conflict, there was chaos. You could lose, you could win, you could destroy, you could be destroyed. So along with that, you had the excitement of, for them, for their rally goers, of absurd theater. That was Elon Musk's whole shtick. The Nazi salute, which, I'm sorry, it was a Nazi salute. The things, carrying whatever it was, a bathroom sink into Twitter, fork in the road. It all seems so stupid and moronic if you're not part of the culture. But part of the reason they have that culture is to troll people outside of it who think it's stupid and moronic. So we have to figure out how to respond. We can't conduct a revolution right away, and we can't conduct the revolution by using their means, because our means don't serve us. But yeah, okay, Tressie McMillan Cottom's piece is entitled "Look Past Elon Musk's Chaos. There's Something More Sinister at Work," and she says of Trump, his mission is not just to dismantle the federal government, but to demoralize it. We know that. She says this confuses some Americans, but feeds their fans what they want, and that Musk serves as a muckraker, creating content for our media environment. I think that's right on. And that she also says the Democrats' response, staged from 20th century media with a lectern, microphones, and standing outside in the cold, could not compete with the emotional power of content. That's it, content. This is a rally of content. So she says the easy answer is that this is just Trump's style, which, while true, does not clearly assess the strategic efficacy of deploying gamified smash and grab antics. That's the theater. That's the display of this giant rally, which she calls the bombastic flouting of norms and laws. As she says, that makes the world easier to understand for Trump Musk followers. It's government and civic life they don't understand. She says, and I'll stop quoting her, this is propaganda, but it is also a skilled manipulation of content in a content-saturated culture, end quote. All right, I'll give her one quote. The chaos is smoke, but the heist is the fire. Don't look away from the smoke. Look through it for what is being taken, redefined, and reallocated. Yeah, it's a kind of crystal knocked of the spirit. And this is the key point. We've reached the point where the real digital Nuremberg isn't just online anymore. It's a way of being. It's a state of consciousness that makes people members of a mob. It makes and wants us all to be members of a mob, even when we're alone. So, what do we do about it? Well, I would argue that on the far tamer liberal side of the problem, the apparent disintegration of MSNBC is a good first step. I think we need independent left media organizations for sure. We need to strengthen the ones that we have. And I also think we need to organize a left that is not dependent on the Democratic Party. On the right, well, we can't combat the right by playing their game. We can't combat the right by playing the Democrats' game. So I'll go back to what I've said in the past, which is that since the digital, well, I haven't said this in the past, but since the digital Nuremberg is now in real life, I think the powerful way to fight them is in real life. I think that that means action. As I've said before, we've had periods in American history of great left uprisings and great left actions. So sure, demonstrations are good, but demonstrations are temporary. Mutual aid organizations would be a great way to go. The populists of the 19th century, the farmer labor movement, had granges and meeting halls and what we would call today support groups. And then we had actions that brought the left out into communities, whether it's the Democratic Socialists of America fixing taillights in Baltimore, or the body shop in Alabama that's run by young communists. I also think it's a matter of identifying shared values, which I'll talk to in a future talk, having clear ideas that are expressed non-jargony in a non-jargony way, knowing our short-term goals as well as our long-term goals and being open about both, and letting a lot of different ideas spring up in the real world. Sure, talking about them online, exploring them online, but the more we can get out and see people and be seen, the more our common humanity takes us out of the digital rally and into human reality. As always, thanks for listening. As always, I welcome your comments and thoughts and suggestions.